The debate over race realism is an uncomfortable one in today's social climate. Often there are small groups stating victory in this discussion on one side or the other, while the majority of people in society either hold a loose opinion or ignore it altogether. Even notably intelligent people will forego their objectivity to argue from a position clearly biased in what they read and what they believe. The truth about genetics, IQ, and race is much more complicated and by no means a settled issue. In these videos, we will go through the arguments and the science carefully to explain exactly why that is, and we will break these up into three main sections: biology, sociology, and philosophy. But first, let's start at the beginning. The most basic description of race realism is acknowledging the differences in race. This is a loaded statement. While it's obvious if you line me up with a native Congolese man, you can see there are greatly different genomic expressions in our bodies. And while we can quantify the differences, those prescribing to race realism tend to adapt this to every facet of human biology. Now, I feel we must make a distinction here. Race realism as a concept is generally benign. It's simply an idea. However, the race realist movement oftentimes has a specific agenda they will claim they do not: superiority. The problems with this will be discussed at length. Since the beginning of recorded history, dehumanizing other races has been a common practice and has been a part of science for centuries. These practices are eventually phased out as unscientific. One such example is phrenology, or the study of skull shape to determine personality and intelligence. So when Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray came out with their controversial book, The Bell Curve, many reactionary people assumed it was similar, but it was not. Before we touch on the problems with Murray and Herrnstein's claims, let's take a pause and examine what many claim the book says. For many who have not read The Bell Curve, there is an assumption that it has a singular focus on race and IQ, or rather, that was the point of the book overall. Others will claim it is a work of pure science. Neither of these are even remotely true. The Bell Curve is a political book using social science and statistics to recommend policy changes. Yeah, that's pretty much largely the impetus for making the book. The authors themselves even add this on page 311. If the reader is now convinced that either the genetic or environmental explanation has won out to the exclusion of the other, we have not done a sufficiently good job of presenting one side or the other. It seems highly likely to us that both genes and the environment have something to do with racial differences. What might the mix be? We are resolutely agnostic on that issue. As far as we can determine, the evidence does not yet justify an estimate. Again, this is social science, not a treatise on genetics, and it's key we mention that while Herrnstein was a psychologist and sociologist, Murray's field of expertise was political science. We will touch more on the bell curve when we get to talking about sociology. For now, I have a few parting statements on it. The data collected is simply that, raw information. Too often people will state in absolutist terms that data does not lie, and they're correct. Data does not lie. However, the accumulating and deciphering of data to be understood to the masses is not a perfect science, and it is as fallible as the person doing the work. I do not throw out the bell curve nor its conclusions, I simply question them from my perspective and my background. What I agree with or disagree with, I will get into at length. It's my firm belief that the majority of those who applaud the bell curve have not read the 800 extremely dry pages. As of this recording, I'm halfway through it myself, and I will finish prior to getting into its full conclusions in episode 3. But before we do, the big question, and what I feel this conversation needs to focus on, is how deeply is intelligence rooted in our biology, and the distinct differences between what experts in genetics say about inherited intelligence versus the claims of the race realism movement. We will put the frankly outdated and fervently defended data to the test against modern science and see whether it stands resolute or it topples. And that is where we will start in our next episode. Lastly, I'd like to take the opportunity to clear something up. You see, during a live stream a month ago, Well, I said this. These people fucking followed me for 6 months, making sock accounts just so they can get around me muting them, being like, why aren't you debating this? There's no fucking debate. And that was wrong. Stated out of exasperation over the issue, I put my foot in my mouth, very arrogantly, simply because I'm so sick of the conversation. At the time, I was overwhelmed by it, and now that I feel rejuvenated, I'm happy to tackle this again. Too often this discussion becomes immersed in identity politics, and much like the frustration I feel over far-left ideologies, I feel the same over far-right ideologies as well. I don't really see them as necessarily that different, but that's why I'm doing this series, and I'm doing it slowly, very slowly, to make sure that I get it right. I want to make sure that, to my best ability, I can accurately describe the problems with the race realist movement, and accurately convey what we do actually know, what is established scientific consensus at the time versus what people will assume based on loose conjecture and old evidence from studies in social sciences. This needs to be bridged between the two, and I feel like this is important work. So I'm happy to do it, but I am going to do it very, very, very slowly. And I have to say that as much as I have very big problems with the bell curve, and I really do, not the data, but the claims, and some of the things that they conveniently ignore, which we'll get into, I have to say that there is some wisdom that you can find in the pages if you really look. In any case, you are not going to learn tomorrow that all the cognitive differences between races are 100% genetic in origin, because the scientific state of knowledge, unfinished as it is, already gives ample evidence that environment is part of the story. But the evidence eventually may become unequivocal that genes are also part of the story. We are worried that the elite wisdom on this issue, for years almost hysterically in denial about that possibility, will snap too far into the other direction. It is possible to face all the facts on ethnic and racial differences in intelligence and not run screaming from the room. That is the essential message. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. It took a long time to get started on this series, and it will take even longer to finish it, if I'm being honest with you. I will say with all sincerity that the more this issue is thrust into my face, the less motivation I have to complete it. So I have to selectively remove myself from some conversations, or I'll never get any of this work done. So for the time being, I'll be working on this in the background while I work on other videos. I very much appreciate your attention and your consideration for this series, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.